Loner rancher bought an orphan with nothing but chains, then melted them into a cross for her. The dust kicked up by Ezra Thompson's boots settled slowly in the still air of Perdition's main street. The town had earned its name honestly. Most folks who ended up here had nowhere else to go, and precious few ever left. Ezra had been one of those lost souls 15 years ago, arriving with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of bitter memories. Now he owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. Though he worked it mostly alone, he hadn't come to town for supplies or socializing. Word had reached him about the auction at the courthouse, an auction that made his stomach turn with a familiar rage. They were selling people again, orphans mostly, to anyone with coin enough to bid. The practice was legal, barely, dressed up in fancy words about indenture contracts and beneficial guardianship, but Ezra knew slavery when he saw it, no matter what they called it. The courthouse steps were crowded with bidders, most of them looking for cheap labor for their farms and businesses. Ezra kept to the back, his weathered face hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. He watched as child after child was paraded before the crowd, their ages read aloud like livestock specifications. Then she appeared. The girl couldn't have been more than 14, with tangled auburn hair that caught the afternoon sun like copper wire. But it wasn't her youth or beauty that stopped Ezra's breath. It was the chains. Heavy iron shackles circled her wrists and ankles, connected by a length of chain that clinked with every reluctant step. The auctioneer yanked her forward by those chains, and Ezra saw her stumble, her bare feet struggling to find purchase on the wooden steps. "This here's Sarah McKenna," the auctioneer called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, previous owner had trouble with her running, hence the metalwork. Starting bid is $50 for a 10-year contract. A merchant from the east side of town raised his hand. 50, 60, called out a saloon owner whose reputation with young girls was known throughout the territory. Ezra's jaw clenched. The girl kept her eyes fixed on the ground, but he could see the tremor in her shoulders, the way she held herself like a cornered animal. Something deep in his chest twisted, a pain he'd thought buried years ago. 70, he heard himself call out, his voice carrying across the crowd. Heads turned. Ezra Thompson rarely spoke to anyone in town, let alone participated in their sordid auctions. The girl looked up for the first time, her green eyes meeting his across the crowd. In that moment he saw something that made his decision final, not the broken spirit he'd expected, but a fierce, unquenchable fire that reminded him of someone he'd once known. The bidding continued, but Ezra matched every offer. When the price reached $200, enough to buy a good horse and saddle, the other bidders fell away. The auctioneer brought his gavel down with finality. Sold to Ezra Thompson for $200. The girl's face went pale as Ezra approached the platform. The auctioneer held out a set of papers, the indenture contract that would make her his legal property for the next decade. Ezra signed without reading, his focus entirely on the chains that bound her. "Keys," he said simply. The auctioneer frowned. "What's that?" "The keys to the shackles." "Oh, those don't come with the purchase. Previous owner kept them, said she was a runner. You'll need to keep her chained if you want to avoid trouble." Ezra's hand moved to the gun at his hip, a gesture so subtle that only the girl noticed. "I said, give me the keys." The auctioneer's face went white. Everyone in 3 counties knew that Ezra Thompson had been a gunfighter before he became a rancher, and his reputation was carved in tombstones throughout the territory. Ezra studied the man's face and decided he was telling the truth. He pulled out his wallet and counted out the money, then held out his hand to the girl. She stared at it for a long moment before tentatively placing her shackled wrists in his palm. The ride back to the ranch was silent, except for the rhythmic clinking of chains and the steady hoofbeats of Ezra's horse. The girl sat behind him in the saddle, her chains wrapped around the saddle horn to keep her secure. He could feel her tension, the way she held herself as far from him as possible while still maintaining her balance. The Thompson ranch sprawled across a valley between 2 ridges of red stone, with a creek running clear and cold through the center. The main house was modest but well built, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. As they approached, several ranch hands looked up from their duties, their faces curious but respectful. Owidirena had always been fair with his workers, paying good wages and asking no questions about their pasts. He helped the girl down from the horse and led her into the house. The front room was spartanly furnished but clean, with a stone fireplace and shelves lined with more books than most people in the territory had ever seen. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the unexpected sight. "Sit," Ezra said, gesturing to a chair near the fireplace. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the seat like she expected to run at any moment. The chains pulled at her feet with a sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Ezra disappeared into another room and returned with a hammer and chisel. The girl's eyes went wide with fear, and she pressed herself back into the chair. "Easy," he said, his voice gentler than she'd heard before. "I'm not going to hurt you." He knelt beside her chair and examined the shackles. They were crudely made but solid, designed more for cruelty than security. The iron had worn raw patches on her wrists and ankles, some fresh, others long-healed scars that spoke of months or years in chains. This might be loud, he warned, then began working with the hammer and chisel. It took the better part of an hour to break the shackles. Ezra worked carefully, wrapping cloth around the chisel to protect her skin, stopping frequently to check that he wasn't hurting her. With each link that snapped, he saw a little more life return to her eyes. When the last shackle fell away, the girl rubbed her wrists and stared at the pile of iron on the floor. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse from disuse. "Why?" Ezra gathered up the broken chains, their weight substantial in his hands. "Because nobody should wear these. What do you want from me?" The question hung in the air between them. Ezra had asked himself the same thing during the ride home. He looked at this girl, this child who had been bought and sold like livestock, and saw something he'd thought lost forever. "What's your name?" he asked instead of answering. "Sarah. Sarah McKenna." "Well, Sarah McKenna, you hungry?" She nodded tentatively, and Ezra moved to the kitchen. As he prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried meat, he found himself talking, something he rarely did with anyone. "I built this ranch from nothing," he said, slicing the bread with practiced ease. "Came here 15 years ago with less than you've got now. This valley was empty then, just wild cattle and wilder men. I fought for every acre, every head of stock." Sarah watched him work, her expression guarded but attentive. "I did things I'm not proud of," Ezra continued. "Killed men who needed killing, and maybe a few who didn't. Made enemies and buried friends, but I built something here, something good." He set the plate in front of her and watched as she ate with the careful hunger of someone who'd never known when her next meal might come. "The papers I signed make you my ward for 10 years, he said finally, "but papers are just words. You can leave any time you want. Walk out that door right now if you've a mind to." Sarah paused, a piece of bread halfway to her mouth. "And go where?" "Anywhere you want. I'll give you money, provisions, whatever you need." "Why would you do that?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because 15 years ago someone gave me a choice when I didn't deserve one. Maybe it's time I passed that kindness along." Sarah finished her meal in thoughtful silence. When she was done, she looked around the room again at the books, the comfortable furniture, the windows that showed the vast expanse of the ranch. "If I stayed," she said carefully, "what would you expect? Work, same as anyone. This is a working ranch. Everyone earns their keep. And the other things." Her voice was barely a whisper, but the meaning was clear. Ezra's face darkened. "There are no other things. You work, you eat, you sleep safe in your own bed, that's all." Something in his tone convinced her. Sarah nodded slowly. "I'll stay. For now. Fair enough." That night, Ezra showed her to a small room at the back of the house. It had a bed with clean sheets, a washstand, and most importantly, a door with a lock on the inside. "No one will bother you here," he said. "You have my word on that." After Sarah had closed the door, Ezra returned to the front room and stared at the pile of broken chains. In the firelight, the iron looked like what it was, instruments of torment and despair. But as he picked up one of the heavier pieces, an idea began to form. The next morning, Sarah emerged from her room to find Ezra already gone. Through the kitchen window, she could see him working with the ranch hands, moving cattle from one pasture to another. A Mexican woman named Rosa, who served as cook and housekeeper, explained that Ezra had left instructions for Sarah to rest and recover for a few days before taking on any duties. "El Jefe, he is good man," Rosa said in her accented English. "Hard but good. You are safe here, Niña." Over the following days, Sarah began to explore the ranch. It was larger than she'd imagined, with several thousand head of cattle spread across dozens of pastures. The ranch hands were a mix of American cowboys, Mexican vaqueros, and a few former slaves who'd made their way west after the war. They treated her with polite distance, following Ezra's lead and giving her space to find her footing. Ezra himself was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was unfailingly polite but distant, speaking to her only when necessary. Yet she often caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't interpret, not hunger or cruelty, but something almost like sadness. On her fourth day at the ranch, Sarah was helping Rosa hang laundry when she heard the rhythmic ringing of hammer on metal coming from one of the outbuildings. Curious, she followed the sound to a small building she hadn't explored yet. Through the open door, she could see Ezra working at a forge, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal arms corded with muscle and marked by old scars. He was shaping something on an anvil, the orange glow of heated metal illuminating his concentrated face. Sarah watched, fascinated, as he worked. She'd never seen metalwork before, and there was something almost mystical about the way he transformed raw iron into precise shapes. It wasn't until he paused to wipe sweat from his brow that she recognized what he was making. The broken chains, her chains, had been reforged into something entirely different. The cruel links and shackles were gone, replaced by carefully crafted pieces that Ezra was assembling into a cross. Not the simple, rough crosses she'd seen in frontier churches, but something elegant and beautiful, with flowing lines and delicate details that spoke of both faith and artistry. "You can come in," Ezra said without looking up. "I know you're there."
Sarah stepped into the forge, feeling the heat from the fire wash over her. "You're making a cross." "I am." He set down his hammer and turned to face her. "From the iron that bound you." "Why?" Ezra picked up one of the completed pieces, part of what would become the vertical beam. "My father was a preacher," he said, his voice quiet in the enclosed space. "Before the war, before everything went to hell, he used to say that God could make something beautiful out of anything, no matter how ugly it started." He turned the piece over in his hands, examining his work. "I stopped believing that for a long time. Thought some things were just too broken to fix, too stained to clean." Sarah moved closer, drawn by something in his voice. "What changed your mind?" "You did." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the forge fire. "I don't understand," she said. Ezra set down the metal piece and looked directly at her for what felt like the first time since he'd brought her home. 15 years ago, I was dying in an alley in San Antonio, gut shot, bleeding out, with nothing to my name but a reputation and regrets. A woman found me there, a widow who had every reason to let me die. Instead, she dragged me to her home and nursed me back to health." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "Her name was Elena. She had a daughter about your age, a girl with green eyes and auburn hair who looked at the world like it owed her nothing but wouldn't break her spirit for all its trying." Sarah's breath caught. "What happened to them?" "Cholera took them both the following spring. I buried them on a hill overlooking her garden. Then I came here and tried to forget." Ezra picked up his hammer again but didn't resume working. "When I saw you on those courthouse steps, wearing those chains but not beaten, you reminded me of her, of Elena's daughter, of the kindness I'd been shown when I deserved none. So you bought me out of guilt. I bought you out of hope." He looked at her again, and this time she saw the pain he'd been hiding. "Hope that maybe I could do something right for once, that maybe Elena's kindness wasn't wasted on a man like me." Sarah reached out and touched the cross he was making, her fingers tracing the smooth curves he'd shaped from her former bonds. "It's beautiful. It's not finished yet. Another few days' work, maybe a week. Can I help?" Ezra raised an eyebrow. "It's hot work, dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Then teach me." Something shifted in Ezra's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the first hint of the smile Sarah hadn't seen since he'd brought her home. "All right, but we start slow." Over the following weeks, Sarah spent her mornings helping Rosa with household duties and her afternoons in the forge with Ezra. He was a patient teacher, showing her how to read the color of heated metal, how to hold the tools properly, how to shape iron with controlled force rather than brute strength. As they worked side by side, the wall between them began to crumble. Ezra told her stories of his wandering years, of towns and people he'd known, of the mistakes that had driven him west and the hopes that had kept him going. Sarah, in turn, spoke of her life before the chains, a childhood cut short when cholera claimed her parents, leaving her ward to relatives who saw her as a burden to be disposed of. "They sold me the first time when I was 12, she said one afternoon as they worked on the cross's horizontal beam. Lewis, who needed small hands for his machinery. Ezra's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I ran away after 6 months. Got caught, of course. That's when they put the chains on me." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Ezra could hear the pain underneath. "Sold me again to a farm family who wanted someone to tend their children and clean their house. Ran away from them too." "How many times?" Ezra asked quietly. 7. 7 different owners. 7 times I ran away." Sarah smiled grimly. "The last one, a mill owner in Kansas. He said I was more trouble than I was worth. That's how I ended up on those courthouse steps." "You never stopped trying?" "No." Sarah met his eyes across the anvil. "I figured dying free was better than living in chains. And now?" Sarah looked around the forge, at the ranch beyond its doors, at the cross they were creating together from the symbols of her bondage. "Now I'm learning there might be something better than either one." The cross was completed on a Sunday morning in late October. Ezra and Sarah had worked through the previous evening, polishing the final details and fitting the pieces together with joints so precise they seemed to flow into one another. When the sun rose, it caught the metal surface and threw patterns of light across the forge walls. "It's finished," Sarah breathed, running her hands over the smooth surface. Ezra nodded, but his expression was troubled. "There's something I need to tell you." Sarah's heart clenched. In the months she'd spent at the ranch, she'd come to think of it as home. The idea of leaving, of returning to the uncertain world beyond the valley, filled her with dread. "The contract papers," Ezra continued, "the ones that made you my ward. I burned them." Sarah stared at him. "When?" "The first night you were here, after you went to bed." "But why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to choose to stay. Not because you were bound by law, but because you wanted to be here." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, the first she'd shed since coming to the ranch. "I do want to stay, even though you're free to go. Especially because I'm free to go." Ezra smiled then, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him. "Then we'd better find a place for this cross." They carried it together to the small cemetery on the hill behind the house, where 2 weathered wooden markers stood over the graves of Elena and her daughter. Ezra had brought them here years ago, unable to bear leaving them in the distant earth where he'd first buried them. As they set the cross between the graves, Sarah understood its true purpose. It wasn't just a symbol of her transformation from captive to free woman. It was a monument to redemption itself, to the possibility that even the darkest chapters of a life could be rewritten. "Elena would have liked you," Ezra said as they stood back to admire their work. "I wish I could have known her. You do know her. Her kindness lives on in what we've built here, in the choice you made to stay." Ezra looked at Sarah, and she saw in his eyes not the broken gunfighter who'd arrived in this valley 15 years ago, but the man Elena's compassion had helped him become. "She's the reason I could recognize something worth saving when I saw it on those courthouse steps." As autumn gave way to winter, Sarah took on more responsibilities around the ranch. She proved to have a natural talent for working with horses, and Ezra began teaching her to ride and rope. The ranch hands, initially wary of the newcomer, came to respect her dedication and skill, but it was in the evenings, when the day's work was done, that Sarah treasured most. She and Ezra would sit by the fire, reading from his collection of books or simply talking about the day's events. Sometimes Rosa would join them, sharing stories of her homeland and teaching Sarah the songs her grandmother had sung. One evening in December, as snow began to fall outside the windows, Sarah looked up from the book she was reading to find Ezra watching her with that expression she'd learned to recognize, not sadness now, but something deeper and more complex. "What is it?" she asked. "I was just thinking," Ezra said slowly, "about how different this place feels now, how different I feel." "Different how?" "Alive," he said simply. "For the first time in 15 years, this feels like a home instead of just a place to hide." Sarah set down her book and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "It is home, for both of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, but inside the house was warm and safe and filled with the kind of peace that can only come from choosing love over fear. "Ezra," Sarah said eventually. "Yes, thank you, for seeing something worth saving when everyone else saw only trouble." Ezra reached out and took her hand, the first time he'd touched her since the day he'd removed her chains. "Thank you for proving that even an old sinner like me can learn to do something right." Years passed, and the ranch prospered. Sarah grew from a frightened girl into a confident young woman, her skills with horses earning respect throughout the territory. Ezra, his harsh edges softened by the warmth of found family, became known as much for his fairness and generosity as for his skill with a gun. The cross on the hill became a landmark, visible from miles away. Travelers would sometimes ask about it, and Rosa would tell them the story of the rancher who melted a girl's chains to make her something beautiful instead. The tale spread throughout the territory, taking on the mythic quality of the best frontier legends. But for Sarah and Ezra, the cross was simply a reminder of the moment their lives truly began, not when they were born, but when they chose to save each other from the chains that bound them, whether made of iron or forged from pain and regret. On Sarah's 21st birthday, Ezra formally adopted her as his daughter, making legal what had long been true in their hearts. She kept the name McKenna, but added Thompson to it, honoring both the family she'd lost and the one she'd found. And sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, they would climb the hill together to tend the graves and polish the cross that stood between them. Sarah would run her hands over the smooth metal, marveling that something once used to bind her had become a symbol of freedom itself. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one such morning, years after that first auction day. "Spending all that money on a stubborn runaway?" Ezra smiled, his hair now more gray than brown, but his eyes still bright with the warmth that had replaced the old coldness. "Best investment I ever made," he said. $200 for a daughter, a partner, and a reason to believe in redemption. I'd call that a bargain." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like a bell. Below them, the ranch stretched out in all its glory, thousands of acres of good grazing land, healthy cattle, and honest work. But more than that, it was home to a family forged not by blood but by choice, strengthened not by shared genetics but by shared grace. The cross caught the morning sun and threw its shadow across the hill, and Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, from chains to freedom, from despair to hope, from a life without choices to one rich with possibility. It was, she reflected, exactly the kind of miracle her father, both fathers, the preacher who'd raised Ezra and the rancher who'd raised her, would have called the work of God's hands, making something beautiful from the broken pieces of the world. And as she and Ezra walked back down the hill toward home, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound not by chains but by something far stronger, the choice to love and be loved in return. The cross stood sentinel on the hill, a testament to transformation and a promise that no matter how heavy the chains that bind us, there is always hope for something better, something beautiful, something free.